Day 693 of this Trump administration, and we have new reporting tonight on a number of fronts, from the president being concerned about his own impeachment to the reporting that he was in the room during hush money discussions in 2015. A source telling NBC News that Donald Trump was in fact in the room when Michael Cohen and the National Enquirer publisher David Pecker discussed ways to the so-called catch and kill theory of stories about Trump's alleged relationships with women, in effect, hush money to make damaging stories go away. The meeting took place in August 2015, just 2 months after Trump announced his presidential run. On Wednesday, the National Enquirer's parent company, American Media Inc., entered into a prosecution agreement with the feds. In the statement of facts section attached to that agreement, AMI, as it's known, admitted it paid $150,000 in hush money to silence damaging allegations against Trump just before the 2016 election. Also says that in August of 2015, Pecker met with Michael Cohen and, quote, at least one other member of the campaign. Wall Street Journal first reported, NBC News has since confirmed, that the president is that, quote, other member of the campaign. This comes as the president is working overtime to try to distance himself from his former personal attorney. On Wednesday, Michael Cohen was sentenced 3 years in federal prison after he pleaded guilty to a number of charges, including campaign finance violations that Cohen said were carried out at Donald Trump's direction. One of those violations, Cohen's role in the aforementioned payments from American Media Inc. to former Playboy model Karen McDougal. The other was a payment to silence Stormy Daniels over her alleged relationship with Trump. Earlier today, during an interview with Fox News, Trump repeatedly said he has done nothing wrong.
Number one, they say it's not a campaign finance violation. Number two, or it's not even under campaign finance. Number two, if it was, it's not even a violation. Number three, it's a civil matter. It's campaign contributions that, if it were even a campaign contribution, is totally legal. You look at stories one after another, they're all legal. The great lawyers that do that stuff are saying there's nothing illegal.
We'll talk about all of it. President Trump also pushed back hard on Michael Cohen's allegations that Trump had directed him to carry out these campaign finance violations.
Let me tell you, I never directed him to do anything wrong. Whatever he did on his own. He's a lawyer. A lawyer who represents a client is supposed to do the right thing. That's why you pay them a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera. He is a lawyer. He represents a client. I never directed him to do anything incorrect or wrong.
Few hours before sitting down for the interview, the president took to Twitter to slam the Russia investigation and Michael Cohen. Trump said Cohen only agreed to the campaign finance violations plea to, quote, embarrass the president and get a much reduced prison sentence. Trump continued making that argument on Fox News.
What he did was all unrelated to me, except for the two campaign finance charges that are not criminal and shouldn't have been on there. They put that on to embarrass me. They put those two charges on to embarrass me. So what happened is either Cohen or the prosecutors, in order to embarrass me, said, listen, I'm making this deal for reduced time and everything else. Do me a favor, put these two charges on. What he did is he made a deal to embarrass me. In order to embarrass me, they cut his term down. How many people, when they say, listen, if you embarrass the president of the United States, we'll give you a deal. Your father-in-law, your wife, we'll cut you jail. That's all it is.
However many uses there of the word embarrassed, we'll get into this later, but the assertion that this is a civil matter is wrong. This is a criminal matter. NBC News is also reporting today that this president is growing increasingly concerned about his own impeachment. Our own Carol Lee, Kristen Welker, and Nicole Wallace wrote together, quote, despite President Donald Trump's public declaration that he isn't concerned about impeachment, he has told people close to him in recent days that he is alarmed by the prospect, according to multiple sources. Trump's fear about the possibility has escalated as the consequences of federal investigations involving his associates and Democratic control of the House sink in. Then there was this headline from the Wall Street Journal late this afternoon. The Journal reporting prosecutors here in Manhattan are investigating whether Donald Trump's inaugural committee misspent some of the record $107 million they raised from donations, and we quote, The criminal probe, which is in its early stages, also is examining whether some of the committee's top donors gave money in exchange for access to the incoming Trump administration, policy concessions, or to influence official administration positions. Earlier tonight on Fox News, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders was asked about that.
This didn't have anything to do with the president. The president was focused on the transition and building out a new government and preparing to take office. The role that the president had in the inauguration was to raise his hand and take the oath. Same thing for the first lady. She wasn't engaged in this process.
With that, let's bring in our leadoff panel for a Thursday night. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Maya Wiley, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, now a professor at the New School. And Daniel Goldman, also a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Good evening and welcome to you all. Maya, I'd like to begin with you. How consequential a development, and all we talk about are consequential developments, is the story putting Donald Trump in the room where it happened?
Is pretty dang consequential.
That's a legal term.
My legal
That's
opinion.
a legal term.
So remember that yesterday when the story broke that AMI had made the no prosecution deal, it had said that there were discussions with the Trump campaign. But it was not clear who in the Trump campaign. And then today we hear that that who was Donald Trump, which makes it a little difficult to track Donald Trump's argument with any, and to think that there's any credibility to this argument that he is not somehow subject to the potential crime of a campaign finance violation if he had asked, right? He says he didn't direct. Even if he didn't necessarily say, I want you right now to go do the following things, he has been told by an attorney that he's going to create a shell company. And then he's going to hide the fact that Donald Trump is repaying him the loans in order to pay the hush money to these women by sending false invoices to the Trump organization to be paid for legal fees. Now, we don't know how much of these details Trump knew or didn't know, but putting him in that room suggests, one, he may have in fact directed it, but certainly the fact pattern that we know to date suggests a criminal absolutely that he may be involved in the crime. And this is the president of the United States of America.
Daniel Goldman, the president, keeps using that word civil to describe this. Basically, same question to you. How does this David Pecker meeting add to the known record?
Right. So many things that he said today on Fox News are flat out wrong. The first is that Michael Cohen has a deal. He doesn't have a deal. And in fact, that's a significant problem to making a case against Donald Trump. But what makes that criminal case a lot better is the fact that David Pecker and AMI are cooperating, and they clearly are going to say that they made the Karen McDougal payment in order to influence the election. Now you have on top of it the closest that Donald Trump will ever get to be to Alexander Hamilton. He's the man in the room where it happened. And what happened was a year before any of these, Access Hollywood or any of the other affairs that came out, was a meeting where they discussed a scheme to conceal his affairs from the voters. So on two fronts, it's a very significant development. You have another person, in addition to Michael Cohen, pointing a finger at Donald Trump himself, not just the campaign. And it now seems to be a very premeditated, orchestrated scheme, not some kind of reaction to the Access Hollywood tape that we have to mitigate the damage any further. This was really a designed plan from the get-go.
Peter Baker, of all the consequential stories and consequential nights when you and I speak at this hour, where, in your view, does this one rank? Where does this story rank? Where are we on the temperature scale?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think that, look, President and his lawyers have spent the last few months focused on discrediting the Russia probe. He says again and again there's no collusion. This is all a witch hunt. They go after Bob Mueller. They say he's conflicted. They offer attacks on his staff. And then out of this left flank comes the Michael Cohen case, which is not run by Robert Mueller, not run by any of the people he's been attacking, but run by the career professional prosecutors of the Southern District of New York, who answer, by the way, to Donald Trump's Justice Department in Washington. And they hadn't basically prepared the public for this. Now, we don't know that it's necessarily going to change the political dynamics. You have not yet seen a lot of Republicans, reacting with great alarm to this. And when we talk about, the consequences of this, we're talking about whether or not it changes Republican minds, not Democratic minds, because Democrats have pretty much already made up their minds about President Trump. So for the moment, he's managing to hold on to his base. I think that's one of the things Carol Lee and the others talked about in their story, is that he knows that the important thing for him at this point is to stay tight with his Republicans in the Senate. That's the thing that will ultimately keep him in office if it ever comes to a battle over impeachment the way it did 20 years ago with Bill Clinton, the last president who was accused of breaking the law to cover up sexual improprieties.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.